The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Okay, everyone, thanks for coming again. Before we start, just a quick thing. Next month in May, libraries and book discussion groups, either neighborhood or in libraries, are taking part in the big read. They're all going to be reading Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. We're going to be having a book discussion here on May 23rd at night. If you want to get a book, there's some copies back there. Our book discussion leader is going to be Suzanne Fisher from Voorheesville. She's on our library system. She's the book discussion guru, so should be great. And we're going to have a new book review of this book in this same format. And our reviewer is going to be Brenda Twiggs. She's the director of Hudson Valley's library. She's a member of many book discussion groups, and I think in the past, I don't think she does anymore, but she's taught African American history, and she was here once before, and she's really great, so come to see her. Today, though, we've been doing our book discussions new book review for like 2 or 3 years now. And I could never pick the best one we ever had, but when Sheila was here last time, she gave the greatest book review. So I'm really happy you came. You're really going to like her. She's very insightful and honest. You'll be amazed. But she teaches down at Albany Med.
I have a copy of this tape, by the way.
I know.
I like that intro.
She teaches at Albany Med and also the Alden March Bioethics Institute, where they they teach doctors ethics courses, and this book is getting a lot of good press. It hasn't made the bestseller list yet, but I think some people were saying it's going to be the new paradigm, or it's going to do what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book did 40 years ago now. We won't know yet, but it seems to be getting a lot of good press. So here's Sheila Otto to tell us all about it.
Or to at least converse with you about it. How about that? Actually, what struck me, how many of you have read the book, by the way? So the rest of you are looking for the short version, then you'll make a decision about whether or not you want to read it. The name of the book is called Last Rites, and it's by Kiernan. And what struck me, I didn't know when Joe gave me the book, that Kiernan is the son of the local Kiernan family, whose name is on some building downtown, as I recall. And he very personally tells the story of both the death of his mother and his father as part of his message here. And the other piece that I didn't know that I really kind of liked about it was that Stephen actually wrote for the Burlington Free Press. And I had gone to college up in Burlington, and so I feel that Burlington is near and dear to my heart. So it was kind of nice to read a book with those two levels of connection between Albany and Burlington. The other thing that struck me as I was coming over today, and I don't know why, it was like a light bulb going on in my head, but the title is called Last Rites, R-I-G-H-T-S. And when I first just glanced at it, I thought, oh, Last Rites. What do you think of when you hear that? Church, right? And for dying people, etc., which maybe is kind of a play on words that he did intentionally, but obviously Last Rites, I think, refers to what are the rights of the patients today dying in our society. So Mr. Kiernan starts out with a very traumatic story of an old lady who had an advance directive which was ignored, as they routinely are, and tells of her having a very prolonged period of intubation and reintubation. Intubation, I presume some of you know, is when you have difficulty breathing and you go to the hospital and they put a tube down your throat into your lungs, and then a machine takes over the work of breathing for you. Finally, again in his opening story, the doctor finally basically kills her with a drug called Norcuron, which is a paralytic agent, so that it paralyzes all your muscles. And it has a very appropriate use for some patients who need to really decrease their energy spent, so to speak, and they won't be able to fight against the ventilator. But obviously, if you're going to take a tube out of somebody and you give them a paralytic agent that doesn't allow them to even try to initiate a breath, that gets into some very sketchy ethical territory very, very quickly. I think in telling the story, he was kind of horrified by it, and he was equally as horrified by the little outcry from the profession, from the professional community, but also the community of this physician's patients. I think this was a doctor who was practicing in northern Vermont. So it's kind of a startling example to start his book on a good death. So again, he puts forth the story of an older woman who had a living will basically that said, I don't want to be intubated, gets to the emergency room, gets intubated, gets extubated, they put the tube back in, out, etc. And then they wind up letting her go finally, but not in the best way possible. And in fact, one could argue it was euthanasia to use a Kiernan if she couldn't even initiate a breath on her own, and again is struck by the lack of public outcry. There have been several doctors that have been prosecuted across the country, it seems to me. I don't know if you've read some stories of physicians who hastened the death of their patients, if you will. And on occasion, they're brought up on charges. And other than Dr. Kevorkian, the famous, lab in the back of his van kind of thing, these patients and their physicians, the patients' families are not usually very upset if there's a long-standing trusting relationship with the physicians. And the physicians, when they're brought to any kind of trial, if that happens, rarely lose these cases. And the point I make that comment is to say that for many of us, if we don't entertain the possibility of what we call a good death, and for some that may even involve someone hastening that death with physician-assisted suicide, so to speak, or euthanasia. That's a whole other topic. I'm not even going to go there, but I think it's important to recognize that people are very afraid of a bad death, and so sometimes you'll wind up with a case similar to this. I mean, the only reason this doctor would have given this paralytic agent was to make it kind of quick and what would look like painless for her family who was at the bedside. So that's how he kind of opens it, and you start out by saying, "Ouch! This is not a good start." Next, we meet Jack, and this is a fictional character who he walks through two different scenarios. First, Jack drops dead while shoveling snow, and we see the hardships endured by the family in such a sudden, unexpected death. In the second scenario, however, we're told that due to the technological advances, Jack's story would likely run a very different path today, one that evolves much like other chronic illnesses. So he makes the point early on, and I would argue very rightfully so, that many of the things that used to kill people in our society rather quickly today have become not acute life-ending disease processes, but chronic problems. How often, I can remember certainly my grandmother who died in a fairly small, short period of time with diabetes and the complications, or renal failure, those kinds of things. People who used to die of a heart attack left and right. I mean, our treatment has evolved to such a degree that many, many people today obviously are going to be able to survive heart attacks, but they don't survive the fact that their heart has been damaged. And so what used to be an acute process now has become, for many of us, a chronic process, meaning that it's a disease process that's ultimately going to kill us, but it's probably going to take a really long time. And so you wind up, hopefully, the author would argue, starting to prepare for those later years or those later chapters. So the author, in describing Jack after the interventions that are available today, the technologies, the medications basically, he describes a patient and a family who understand what is coming and who are prepared and who have no unfinished business. He suggests that in today's world, many of us will live longer with chronic conditions, which ultimately do cause our death, but suggests that his readers view this as a process which offers opportunity and choices. I couldn't agree with him more. I'm just not sure if he's going to be preaching to the audience. I mean, the fact that you people are here says to me you're open to having this kind of a discussion, but there are many people who still are just like, oh, I don't want to talk about that, or, it's almost as if you say the words, it'll make it happen. I used to give this lecture, and I borrowed a line from a friend of mine who says, just as talking about death does not make it happen, neither does avoidance of the topic mean you can live forever. So, I mean, that's a pretty basic tenet to keep in mind. So, in addition to the medical advances, Mr. Kiernan also runs through a lot of behavioral changes which have contributed to longer lives, and makes the claim that consumer demand and sometimes legislated changes in public behavior are responsible. And of course, he gives some really classic examples of seat belts, OSHA regulations, medications, the food supply, no smoking. I think even even though we still have a number of smokers in our society, it's almost as if you're a leper these days if you smoke. I know we have become recently a no-smoking campus, but prior to that, they had these little huts outside that anybody wanted to smoke. It was, you had to go out, it was freezing or raining or whatever. And to ask a class of students, for example, do any of you smoke, very reluctant to raise their hand. It was easier to say, do any of you have leprosy, or do any of you have the plague, or something along those lines. So the point is that there's been lots of national education that I think has made people more aware, and it has certainly cut down on many of the short traumatic deaths. I mean, needless to say, we still have a lot of those deaths in terms of motorcycles or the unfortunate trauma that took place this week. We had the trooper yesterday who I guess was shot in the head, is what the news is saying this morning, so that's clearly not expected, unanticipated death. So we still have those kinds of problems, and we could have a whole other discussion about, the use of guns in our society and whether that's a public health question as well, but we won't go there today. We are also told of the rising expected age of death and the fact that the 85-year-old and older crowd is the largest growing segment of our society. One is reminded at the television advertisements targeting the older but young at heart crowd with Viagra and boost supplements and don't you always want to get hold of those drugs, whatever they are? You see this older couple in this convertible and they're in a hot tub, and I always think, I don't know what they're even talking about, but give me some of that stuff. They're having a really good time, it seems to me. But then we also think of the multi-billion-dollar plastic surgery business and all the anti-aging products. You can turn on QVC and Suzanne Summers is there with her little plastic face and selling products that can take away your wrinkles, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're a society that's very much taken with the idea of not only being youthful, but maybe at the same time saying our image of an older person is not one that has progressive disease processes going on, but one that, is insisting that they're really only 27 years old. There was a nice quote from Christine Castle that he uses. When she was writing in the Institute of Medicine's semi-annual study, Approaching Death, she puts the situation in humble terms. Increasing understanding of genetics, human biology, and longevity should not lead to dreams of near immortality, but rather give us greater respect for the circle of human life. When medicine can no longer promise an extension of life, people should not fear that their dying will be marked by neglect, care inconsistent with their wishes, or preventable pain and other distress. So I think, again, she says, all these advances are wonderful, but don't kid yourself into thinking that you're going to live forever. Death is certainly a part of the natural life cycle. And I think part of it is that we have become so distanced from that. I don't know, for some of you who were here last year, I don't know if you remember me saying that my grandmother and grandfather were Irish immigrants. So being good Irish parents, they had a gigantous family. I think they had 10 kids. But my father always tells the story of his younger brother being born in a back bedroom of the house while his younger sister, who was 3 years old, died of diphtheria, and she was waked in the Irish tradition in the front living room. And I have that image that comes to me often in the sense that just 2 generations ago, for me, people were very familiar with birth and death, the 2 ends of the life cycle. And I think that it was much more acceptable. I mean, clearly, anytime you have death, I don't care if you're 99, is a sense of loss, absolutely, sadness, etc., but nonetheless an acceptance. And I think because death has become so medicalized today, it's a stranger to many of us. We're very fearful, and I'll get back to Mr. Kiernan because he actually touches on that as well. In the next chapter, Mr. Kiernan starts making some controversial points. That's what I always like, a little controversy, but he said some things as if they were Bible truth, I thought. He says it is wrong to use ICUs as a place for dying patients. He cites the incredible costs and refers to a study that claims that medical bills are the leading cause of bankruptcy. He mentions the extraordinary costs of coverage being absorbed by businesses which are having trouble competing in the world market. I think that many of you have read news stories that say that Ford and General Motors spend more on health care insurance for their workers than they do on the steel for their cars. It has clearly impacted many, many businesses in this country when the paradigm seems to be that private business is the one who should pick up the tab for your insurance. Because God knows you can't seem to be able to pay out of your own pocket. It's an extraordinary cost that's usually involved. And yet the fact that we have 50 million people at any given time with no medical insurance speaks to a whole other rationing arm, if you will, of the mess that we are in today. I mean, Joe kind of said that he liked the last time I was the straight shooter and said that the system was kind of a mess. Well, he said, did it get any better? I said, I don't think so. But I am hopeful, given the fact that the presidential campaigns will be upcoming, that it will at least be a relevant topic that engenders lots and lots of conversation, just as the Bill Gates Foundation is trying to put educational conversation to the top of the priority list. I think that we have to address some of our outrageous medical systems problems at this point. For all the money that we spend, if you look at any of the World Health Organization figures, it's not as if we're really getting a great bang for our buck. So there's lots and lots of issues. So I think his point is controversial, however, even though many people may share that point of view, because our society has failed time and time again to reach any kind of consensus about what we see as right or wrong in the distribution of these resources. You'll remember when the Hillary Clinton plan was first put out in the beginning of the Clinton presidency, and how there was lots and lots of controversy, and people were complaining that the proper people were not invited to the table, etc. But I think what really came out of that conversation loud and clear, and this, remember, was preceded by a national discourse during that election year that everybody said, my God, this is terrible. You know, they had people telling their stories of bankruptcy, etc. But when she really tried to make some kind of a plan, it became evident that there were so many special interest groups that wanted their own piece of the pie covered that there was no consensus reached at all. But it struck me, and maybe it struck you, that after there was such a resounding defeat to the Clinton plan at that time, it kind of went off the radar screen, and we just kind of forgot about talking about it. Well, the issues didn't change. They didn't get better automatically by themselves. And for me personally, it was quite discouraging because I thought, you know, our society, we're very complex, we're very pluralistic, and that's what makes us who we are. But how inefficient if we simply cannot deal with complex topics. If people are unwilling to compromise and everybody is just out for their own interest base, you're not going to really get anywhere. More recently, Terry Schiavo case. I don't want to spend too much time on that because that was the case that I thought was never going to end, frankly, in the media. That case went on for 10 years, and I mean, good God, Martin. But she was certainly treated in an ICU initially, and although she was not actively dying at that time, her brain certainly was. Would PVS be treated with life-supporting artificial nutrition? I mean, in her case, clearly it was. She was being kept alive, as were the cases of Kiernan, Quinlan, and whom some of you may remember, New Jersey, and Nancy Cruzan. They're kept alive not on life support in terms of ventilators or dialysis machines, however, but they do have artificial nutrition, which again is a medical intervention. Now, in Mr. Kiernan's suggestion, you wouldn't treat somebody like that in an ICU. I don't know that we could as a group reach consensus about that. We certainly as a nation did not reach consensus about what should happen in her care. I think that what I didn't really like about that case was that it was such a private, intimate, personal matter that became fodder for different political groups who really used her, I think, as a pawn in a major chess game. I think that was a very, very tragic and sad case, and I'm sorry that her privacy really went out the window. You could literally view her CAT scans on the internet if you wanted to. Something not right there. But in Mr. Kiernan's view, what would we do with PVS patients, persistently vegetative patients who continue to get infections? Would we treat them with antibiotics? If their kidneys failed, would we put them on dialysis? Would we use ventilators, etc.? He mentions the fact that there are currently about 35,000 patients in our country who are in a persistent vegetative state. So how we are going to treat someone in that particular condition, we certainly have no consensus around. And I think you have to understand that, without getting political here, that the same Congress who came in on their Easter break, so to speak, to review the Terry Schiavo case so that she could get yet another possibility to continue her life was the same Congress who had taken $15.5 billion out of the Medicaid budget. Now, without trying to side with one side or the other, all I want to make a point of saying is you can't have it both ways. If you want to, in fact, support all comers at all levels, and that's your strong philosophy, okay, but then be prepared to pay for it. And it's going to cost a lot more than you're currently paying, and there's a lot of costs that are involved here, period. What about the good 82-year-old who's had a terrible course after his open heart surgery and now cannot get off the ventilator and needs dialysis? This is something I see probably in a skewed vision because I do so many rounds in our intensive care units, and clearly many people go through these operations and just sort of whiz through and are back home in 5 days or whatever. But there are a number of people who wind up with terrible, unexpected complications post-operatively, wind up needing life support in many different forms. Does age become a part of the equation in terms of how we're going to limit ICU beds for dying patients? Are these patients actively dying? Do we say no to ICU for some of these patients, and based on what? When we talk about terminal patients, usually the framework is expected to live 6 months or less. Although I don't know if any of you have read Art Buchwald's stuff or seen him interviewed on TV recently. Not too recently, he died finally, I think about 2 months ago. But the last interview I saw with him was he was his usual very funny self. And 8 months prior to that, he had made a decision to stop dialysis. And of course, anybody in medicine knows that if you're dependent on dialysis, you usually have about 2 weeks to live after you stop it because the toxins build up in your body, etc. Well, he was enrolled in hospice at that time, and 8 months later, he was still alive and kicking. So he was making jokes about how everybody should get the opportunity to be dying, because he said friends came from out of the woodwork, and they all told him how wonderful he was, and they kind of evaporated after he was hanging on a little bit longer than they expected. But what does terminal mean? We're all terminal on one level. But terminal patients still may make good use of that time frame, as the author's mother did. I'm trying to think if I included much in my thing here about how his mother and father died. Just in a nutshell, for those of you who have not yet read the book, his father had a ruptured aneurysm, which is a big deal. It's basically an aneurysm, for those of you who don't know, is a weakening in one of the major vessels of your body so that the wall begins to bulge out. And sometimes you'll actually get a separate supply of blood going down here. So it's like a hose with a bulging, weak side to it. And if that ruptures, there's tremendous blood loss. And I think in his dad's case, what happened was that there was tremendous blood loss, and he was not waking up properly, and his kidneys shut down as a result of this blood loss. And I don't think he was going to be able to move his legs, etc. He had a terrible course, as I recall. And the family all came in from wherever they were, and they were around this bed, and it was unexpected, obviously. They knew him as a very vital, alive man, and yet this was this terrible acute event that they were not at all prepared for. And so there was, this constant, well, let's try a little bit more, well, let's do a little bit of this, well, let's do a little bit of that. And he says, looking back on his father's death, that it should not have continued on as long as it did with the acute care. And I think at one point they transferred him from a hospital on Cape Cod to Boston because that's where the experts were. And, again, this idea that you really want to do the best for your family member, and so you're going to transfer them to the best doctors in New York or whatever else, when in fact, even the best doctor doesn't have a magic wand that can fix some of this stuff. However, when he beats himself up about decisions made along the line to keep his dad alive all those extra days and to go those extra 9 yards, I would say that it wasn't necessarily certain on day 10, because I think he lived 28 days ultimately. It wasn't certain what his outcome would be. Should he have limited his options earlier on? Based on what? On his age? Based on the uncertainty? Based on how many life supports were compromised at that time? Was he terminal at that point? Was he actually dying? The distinctions in terms lend themselves to a multitude of interpretations, and I certainly see this in our ICUs right now. I was talking with a woman yesterday whose dad is currently a patient, and he has underlying very bad lung disease. He's 86 years old, I believe, and he lives with her, And he's been deteriorating over the last year. Well, he's deteriorated yet again and is in the hospital. And the question is, should he go on a ventilator or not? And she really struggles. She struggles on many levels. She's not sure what he would want. She wanted to have a conversation with him, and he was making a lot of jokes about what kind of a machine it would be, and maybe yes and maybe no. But I find that for many people, particularly of a certain generation, they don't really want to talk about these issues, so they make jokes about it. My own mother is 91, and she always tells me she's afraid when she makes me she made me her proxy, but she tells me she's always afraid I'm going to cut her short. And I say, at 91, how much shorter, can you get cut? But the idea that this man, the father, Mr. Kiernan, was alive, well, active, mowing his lawn the day before this aneurysm burst. And we see this an awful lot in the hospital as well. What do you mean he's not doing well? He was mowing the lawn yesterday. What are you talking about? He's 82, but he's a great 82. He's a fighter. You must have done something wrong. This idea that somehow, even though the family member is elderly and something major has broken down, it somehow doesn't make any sense to a lot of people. And it has nothing to do with logic. I think it all has to do with emotional stuff. I'll get back to his mom in a minute, but I would say that, just following along some of my notes here because I did it sequentially with the book, he writes about advanced directives, that few people have them and that they are vague and they are routinely overruled, that healthcare professionals are unaware of them or too busy to read them. Actually, I would say that based on my experience, this is either changing or simply not true. And for those of you who came in late, there are 2 papers on the back table, one of which is an informational paper about advanced directives, the other which is a living will on one side and a healthcare proxy designation form on the other side. And at the end of the talk, maybe we'll get a minute to answer any questions about them. But I think that and I was talking to this gentleman here who said the VA has done a really nice job of securing people's advanced directives. So although this is a very current book, my guess is that practice varies from place to place and state to state and city to city. But I think that people are coming into the hospital more and more with some kind of an advanced directive in hand. If the patient has an advanced directive, hopefully the family, the friend, or the primary care doc knows about it, even if the patient didn't bring it with them. The assumption, however, in coming to the emergency room is that you are there for care. The emergency room is not the time to start the conversation. The emergency room is all prepared to jump into, fast mode as soon as you walk through the doors because that's what their job is. They're there to save lives and to stabilize people. Should patients with chronic disease have an advanced directive, and should they have had the conversation with the family and the doctor? Absolutely. I was with this man I was talking about yesterday in the ICU. It seems to me that if he's been followed by a pulmonologist in the community for literally years, that should be part of the discussion, part of the overall discussion. But there are many studies that say the patients are waiting for the doctors to bring this stuff up, and the doctors are waiting for the patients to bring it all up. So it certainly doesn't get addressed and slips between the cracks. Docs say, I just said this. So it slips between the cracks, and although we have some things like the Joint Commission, which mandates that everyone be asked on admission to the hospital if they have an advanced directive or would like to fill one out. How many of you have an advanced directive currently filled out? That's a good showing, actually. And those of you who don't, anybody want to venture a guess why you don't? Never heard of them. Wow, okay, well, I'm glad you came today. An advanced directive basically is, in New York State, typically the designation of a healthcare proxy, which is a healthcare agent, meaning that if something were to happen to you where you couldn't speak for yourself, this other person has all legal authority to speak on your behalf and should be speaking in your voice. The living will is more of a generic document that basically says, usually, if I'm never going to wake up or if I'm terminally ill, don't prolong my dying, make sure you keep me comfortable, but don't use a lot of stuff. I always say, though, that also gives you the opportunity, if you feel the opposite way, to make clear those wishes. We mentioned Terry Schiavo. My guess is that based on what her parents have said in the media, that they would have a very strong bias to keep living as long as possible, regardless of the quality of life. So a living will would also give you the opportunity to write down those kinds of values down. Mr. Kiernan, again, says that 70% of doctors do not address code status. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that. It's an entirely different topic, but it's not as simple as many people think. Code status is do not resuscitate. You sort of see that on your house programs, house and ER and all those kinds of things. But it is a physician's order that says if you have a cardiopulmonary arrest, that attempts will not be made to bring you back. Many people say, oh, I would never be a DNR, because they think that if they choose resuscitation, they're choosing death. That's really not the case. And again, if we have some time at the end, perhaps we could get back to that and answer some questions if you have any of them. In the next chapter, Stephen unleashes his wrath against the nursing homes. He says there are too many residents that are restrained, meaning tied down literally. There are nutritional and cleanliness problems. There are pressure sores. There's a lack of confidentiality and privacy. He says residents are at risk and they are often humiliated. He strongly suggests that we should be spending our money more on non-clinical services and less money on clinical services. Again, let me just read you a short quote from the RAND Corporation or the RAND Institute that says, patients must navigate a fragmented care system, offering them a patchwork of uncoordinated services that do not meet their needs. Indeed, the experience of an increasing number of families confirms the point that healthcare arrangements for persons with chronic illness often do not function smoothly, reliably, or well. So he's saying we're spending an awful lot of money on ICUs and end-of-life very aggressive care, and maybe we should be reprioritizing what services are more helpful and useful to people as they get older with their chronic diseases in terms of being supportive. Several years ago, the EDI, the local EDI organization, brought in a speaker from Sweden who spoke about the care provided in that society for their elderly and sick. It was probably about at least 10 years ago, but it really made a very strong impression on me, who was working in the ICUs at that point. The focus was on quality of life. In the U.S., we have a love affair of technology, let's face it. We just love that the fact that, they're making a new MRI with, 10 million cuts, and they use stents, and we really love the technology aspect. And indeed, it's really quite remarkable and very wonderful for many, many patients. Most people I know have, rightly or wrongly, a very negative impression of nursing homes. I don't know if any of you have any good stories of nursing homes, but I certainly have known of people who've gone and flourished. I mean, I have a friend whose father was 100 when he finally went to a nursing home, and she told me he was like the hottest item in the place. First of all, he was like the only man. But that he had a great time, that he got, his medications were delivered properly. Her elderly mother, who really could not take care of him at home any longer, would get to visit him, etc. Excuse me. But I think he felt better not being a burden to his wife. I think he felt safe. I think he felt cared for. He, again, was a pretty hot item in the dining room. But he got to play bingo or whatever they do, I don't know. But bottom line is he had a good quality of life until he finally died, I think, at age 102. But their experience was very, very pleasant. My own personal experience, and again, I think each of us forms an opinion based on the experience that we've had, either with a family member or a friend. My mother-in-law was in a place in Philadelphia, and they took excellent care of her. So I think that there are such things as good nursing homes, and yet I jokingly say the three words that bring terror to the heart of every American are nursing home placement. And we have an awful lot of people who survive their hospital stay, but they're not going to be able to be cared for at home. And the families say, we never wanted to go to a nursing home. And the patients always say, I never want to go to a nursing home. Well, I don't think anybody's dying to get in there. On the other hand, that may be, in fact, the best level of care that's available to take care of you and meet your needs at a given point. Just a generation ago, extended families took care of their elderly relatives. In today's environments, however, most families need 2 wage earners, and nuclear families are spread across many miles. So I think that how we treat our elderly is clearly a dynamic process, but based on the society as it's set up today, there are not too many of us who are able to take an elderly parent or relative into the house and provide proper care. Nursing home workers are typically minimum wage staff with few RNs, and the patient-staff ratio is likely not too small. Neither are they cheap. There are 3 payment possibilities. Long-term care insurance, and how many people have that? I don't think too many. I don't have it, but I understand that it's quite expensive. Private pay, I think you'd go through your money pretty fast. And Medicaid. A person's savings can be depleted in a year if you were paying out of pocket. And so you're left with Medicaid, and of course that involves spending down all of your assets, et cetera. So that sometimes sends ripples through a family that are afraid about losing, a family property or something along those lines. When a patient must live in a nursing home, there's an underlying dependence on others for help. Patients are often elderly, and many suffer from dementia. These patients are currently treated the same as every other healthy 40-year-old, and if they get pneumonia or an infection, it's common for them to wind up in an ICU. The author seems to suggest that this is not a wise policy. What do you think? He's basically saying, what are you doing? What are you spending all this money on that phase of life? Is there anybody who thinks that that care should not be automatically available to people who've reached a certain age or reached a demented state or some other limitations? Anybody want to put limits down? You do?
I think it should be just in discussion with the family and the other loved ones. I suppose if he doesn't have anybody or she in a nursing home, then of course the nursing home would be making the decision. I don't think it should be an automatic thing.
So you don't want to have consistent policies. You want each individual case to be reviewed individually. And you want families to be the primary care decision makers. Is there anybody who thinks differently? I would just throw in from an ethics perspective, justice is one of the 4 major principles that we try to apply. Should I be discriminated against because I am poor, I don't have the assets, and I don't have any family around who are willing to take care of me, and therefore I should get a different pathway, so to speak, than somebody else who's demented in a nursing home that doesn't have somebody looking out for them? You know what I'm getting at? I'm trying to say, if you really want it to be a just society, shouldn't you apply consistent criteria across the board? So what would those consistent criteria be? That's going to be the million-dollar question, so to speak. Mr. Kiernan echoes many people's fears of intractable pain and loss of control toward the end of life and refers to the death with dignity law in Oregon. Many of you, I presume, are familiar with that. It's like a physician-assisted suicide law, and it was recently taken off the table in Vermont. They were going to have some kind of a referendum, but it didn't have the votes to get on the ballot box or whatever. And I think it's also resurfacing again in California. That's come up in California a couple of times and been defeated each time. But Oregon is the only state currently with a death with dignity law. There were a lot of fears when this law first went into place in Oregon, and you may recall that we'd be like lemmings at every other state in the union. We'd be taking our RVs and going over into Oregon so we could all get physician-assisted suicide if that's what we wanted. In fact, that has not happened, and they have some pretty strict criteria about who is eligible to participate in that program. Over a period of 7 years, that's almost how long the program has been in effect, how many people would you guess would have taken advantage, roughly speaking, taken the medication that was available to them specifically for the purpose of dying?
Very few.
Very few? Anybody have a different thought? 10? 208 people took the prescribed medicines to cause death over a period of 7 years. So that, I think initially it was like in the single digits and then has grown a little bit, but it has not certainly been this mass suicide, so to speak. I have 208 people over 7 years. Interestingly, and this is, I think, the real story, interestingly, during that same period, hospice referrals more than doubled, and pain medications were prescribed in much higher numbers to alleviate the intolerable end-of-life symptoms. I think the lesson learned from Oregon is that many people were very afraid of that final stage because of the pain and suffering. And when you actually had this safety net of being able to take a prescription that would kill you, Doctors were trying to be very supportive, and they paid a lot more attention, I think, to pain complaints. Again, there was a great increase in hospice referrals as well as pain medication at that time. And they say that when they interview families or whatever of the people who actually did take advantage, the reason that they did is not because they were in intractable pain, but because they wanted control over that final chapter in their life. So it was almost more of a philosophical reason why they wanted that. Again, this is not a talk on physician-assisted suicide. The author brought it up. In doing his research, he comes across Diane Meyer, a strong palliative specialist in New York City who is all about helping people to achieve the best quality of life for as long as possible. We use some of her films to teach our medical students today. She has a program for palliative care that has expanded over the years and is often cited as a leading example of comprehensive, humane care. Hospice is praised as an extension of palliative care, although the author faults the hospice organization as having too strict a criteria for enrollment and finds that the low insurance reimbursements serve as a disincentive for physicians to enroll patients in the hospice program. A few words about palliative care. Hospice was an organization what time do we have to close this, by the way? 1-ish? Because you know me, I could talk till like 4:30 if we wanted here. I should go through quickly and basically say that hospice was started by Dame Cicely Saunders in London in the 60s, and it has certainly grown phenomenally over the years. But what we call palliative care is a little bit broader. Palliative care we think of as the comprehensive care of patients whose disease process is no longer curative. But palliative care, you can have like visiting nurses and have a palliative team watching over your care, but it doesn't put so many limits on your care. For many, many years, hospice would say we're not going to give antibiotics or we're not going to give blood products. They put a lot of limits up. And many people say, I want to live as long as I can, as long as the quality is okay. So yes, I'm terminal, but I'm not quite ready to say enough is enough already. You understand what I'm saying in terms of the difference? One is a little bit more expansive and will allow more.
Isn't there a difference in reimbursement? Don't you need insurance to get palliative care? Is that covered by Medicare?
Yes.
Oh, it is?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh.
In fact, it's a certifiable subspecialty in medicine.
Palliative.
Yep,
I didn't know.
absolutely. The author once again talks about John Wenberg, who's a famous Dartmouth professor who's looked at the differences in healthcare delivery as well as outcomes geographically. His conclusion is that more money does not equal longer lives or better deaths. And I have on my paper in bold print, which I thought was a great quote, families confuse medical persistence with genuine devotion. Stop and think about that for a second. I think it's very true. The ability to anticipate life's end could be as terrifying as a condemned man's walk to the gallows or as liberating as a bird taking flight. Many families will say, don't tell my mother she's got cancer, you'll take away all of her hope. Meanwhile, in my experience, mom already knows. But when people start pussyfooting around and holding information back, the message is mom can't feel comfortable talking with the family because they're trying to protect her, but in fact they're shutting down a whole avenue that she might need to go down. I work with medical students who are very nervous about taking away someone's hope. And I would say you have to simply, at the end of life, redefine hope. Hope for what? You're not going to get a cure. So hope for what? I can think of many things that I would hope for. I'd hope to be comfortable. I'd hope to be in my house. I'd hope that my kids were in town. I'd hope that my husband was still there and wasn't with some 24-year-old down the corner. My point is there are many ways to define hope. It's not all about just being cured of your disease process. Pain, people who are in pain today, I just think it's unforgivable. People who are actively dying should not be in pain. There's so many drugs and things that are available in our armamentarium today that a doctor who's not willing to treat pain effectively, I would say I'm going for another opinion from somebody else. I think that there's so much available today that pain should not be on the screen. He then examines death in the hospital, how staff react and how families react. And again, we were talking a little bit earlier about the fact that we're so unfamiliar with death, families don't know what to expect. he sort of paints a picture that I've seen on many occasions where the family will come to the door and look in, and you know in their eyes they're like the deer in the headlights, and they're thinking, oh my God, with all those machines and tubes, and they'll say, oh, he's sleeping, I don't want to disturb him, and, you know, run down the hall as fast as they can. The idea that, and you know, other families are, they bug the nurses because they figure if they're not all over the nurses that maybe the job won't get done properly, which of course drives the nurses completely crazy. But that's a whole other thing too. I mean, the Institutes of Medicine basically tell you, the general public, you better be on top of that care or they'll kill your mother. Ask what's in that bag, ask what's the dose, when are they going to get it, etc. And yet if you actually do that every time, there doesn't leave a lot of time left over for the nurse to deliver the care. So, you know, it's a tricky time. He talks about the training of physicians, that they need more emphasis and more strong role models for dying patients. One thing that I would criticize this book for is that he doesn't give much attention to nurses who actually perform the tasks and emotional investment. It's the nurse who's there, you know, every day, 8 hours, 12 hours, whatever. They're the ones who are delivering the care. They're the ones who are emotionally drained by the fact that every time they have to turn this person over, he's in agony, or that his wound is just getting worse and worse, and that, you know, et cetera. There's a lot of emphasis on physicians, but anybody who's been in a hospital knows the physician comes around on rounds and spends 3 minutes looking in the room and talking about the patient, writes an order and leaves. It's the nurse at the bedside who is underwritten, the story that's not told in this book, that I think is a whole complex other issues. There are many nurses who almost feel that the patient becomes part of their family because, particularly when families are not available to be at the bedside, the nurse is there, and the one that is oftentimes the last person that the patient sees. You know, and that's a whole other thing about death and being there or not being there. I guess we all just come from different experiences, but as a nurse I would never let somebody die by themselves. But I don't really want me to be the last person there with them because it's like such an intimate moment in one's life. But I digress. Throughout much of the book, Mr. Kiernan makes points through the use of personal stories. Doctors are told that families are too emotional, doctors won't discontinue vents, family dynamics are complex, fragmented care. You know, a lot of the complaints that he has, hopefully when you're aware that those things are possibilities out there, you don't put up with it. You have a physician basically who wouldn't discontinue a ventilator given the wishes of the patient and the family. You call for an ethics consult today. You say, wait a minute, you know, you're not driving this bus. The family and the patient is driving the bus. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, but there's a right or wrong answer for that particular patient. Family dynamics, very complex. It's always the daughter from California who hasn't seen mom in 3 years who suddenly arrives at the doorstep and is going to be her savior. Mom's a fighter, we're going to do 43 more tests, and meanwhile the daughter who's been living with her says, whoa, you know, mom's been really decompensating for a long time and she's ready to go. Leave her alone already. So lots of unfinished business comes into play at that point. When he talks about his father's death, he says that for the dad's death, the family was completely unprepared, unschooled, and unassisted. Not just hoping for a miracle, but expecting one, which I thought was a real interesting layman's perspective. His story is a very personal one. Perhaps that is why it is so gripping. His place is in the family, the unfinished business with the father, 8 people trying to make decisions. There was a lot going on within the family dynamic. I mean, you could be a psychiatrist to walk through the whole thing. But I like the fact that he was so insightful. And he said, you know, out of 6 children, I was, what is he, the youngest? Is that what he was? He was down in the totem pole, and the bottom line was that he wasn't going to be the decision maker in the family. And I guess there was a brother who was actually a trained physician who was very helpful in guiding the family. But every family has different roles for different members, and different kids who step up to the plate and want to be the boss, and other kids who resent that, but other kids who can't deal with it, etc. So it's a very complicated time in one's life. Then they helicoptered the father to Mass General. He asks in retrospect for whom and why, but my guess is at the time they actually thought that maybe something good would come out of this. And obviously they were doing it for the father if they thought he was going to get better. But you and I talked a little bit earlier how sometimes it's for the family trying to assure themselves that they've done the right thing by their parent, or they've given them the best care or more care. When the father's kidneys finally failed, in retrospect, he calls out an opportunity for setting limits, but instead they opted for more care, more intervention, and more heroism. In the end, the father dies after 28 days in the ICU. Not that it's politically correct to ask at what cost, but my rough guess would be easily over $100,000. And I think this speaks to some of the point of his book. But this is great to Monday morning quarterback. In the throes of this acute event, I don't think he was thinking quite straight. And if perhaps it was a different outcome from the father, maybe the book wouldn't have been forthcoming. And I think that that's half the problem today, is that there is always some level of uncertainty. I counseled a woman 2 weeks ago to please let your husband go, it's his time. I mean, I won't even give you the circumstances. And she said, I know you're right, but it's so hard. And she had young children. And I said, you know, you have to do the right thing by him. Well, she stalled, and I'll be darned if he didn't turn around and make a recovery that everybody is just talking about as absolutely miraculous. And what I said to her, I was telling the story to my students, and they said, oh my God, are you going to feel awkward going back and talking to her? And I said, no. I said, because, you know, when I spoke to her, I spoke from my heart. I didn't have an agenda that I was trying to put over. And I just said to her, medicine is a very humbling business. And indeed it is. But there's oftentimes uncertainty that you can't predict. Again, just to follow up on his personal experience, the father's death had set the stage for his mother's last chapter. He speaks of the need for an advocate to help a patient get through the system and sort through the choices. Luckily, the one brother was a doc and was able to be realistic about the choice proposed by one renowned surgeon to drastically cut out the disease. For those of you who, do you remember this? That really struck me too, that the mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and basically the home team said, you need to go on palliative care, it's not responsive to therapy, you're going to die from this. But there was the surgeon, you know, the hot shot in New York, who, I'm not prejudiced against New York, I swear, I just came out that way, who basically said, oh yes, I have this wonderful procedure, and I could, Peter Kiernan describes it as, you know, cutting her basically from her collarbone all the way down and over in this horrendous, gigundous operation, that the mother basically said, what, are you completely crazy? Forget about it, I'm not going there. And her kids apparently were very supportive, knowing that it was her choice. His mother was not going to chase miracles, but rather to die on her own terms, which again would be at home. He talks about the intimate moments for each of the family members with their mother and her quiet and peaceful death, with an obvious comparison in mind to the father's death, which was all high-tech and out of control. Their family learned how to let a loved one die well. It is clear that he learned a lot and now views death as an opportunity to reaffirm all of life that is noblest, most compassionate, and most courageous, as he says. I would also say that he's very lucky to have had both experiences and to be able to realize that it's okay to let go. And it was also, I mean, to me, the key too is that the mother was driving her own bus. I mean, she basically had her life experiences, and I'm sure that the event with her husband made her biased in one direction or the other, but she was able to say, this is what I want, whereas when the family has to make the decisions, there's a lot of guilt and unfinished business that comes into play. Excuse me. He uses the Vermont autumn, and this is, I'll just sort of finish up here. He uses the Vermont autumn as a metaphor for viewing that period before the winter as the most beautiful time of the year. The biggest challenge Kiernan sees is the attitudinal change that's needed, that dying patients accept their condition and that loved ones join in that recognition, and society organizes itself around the idea that death with dignity is appropriate and attainable. He makes some suggestions about the role of government, both federal and state, about the education of physicians and the preparation we should all be doing, namely advanced directives. He says, being with dying patient takes a lot out of you, but it also puts a lot into you. Dying patients will often write that they found meaning in life in that last chapter that they had not recognized before. He says that caring for the dying is not a burden, but a redemption. And he talks, two final comments. He says, if you want a meaningful death, have a meaningful life. Sounds like a cliche to me. I mean, sure, it's a good idea, but... And then he says, be mindful of temporariness. And
I always close these kind of lectures with my joke that if you've heard it before, close your ears. But the temporariness always strikes a familiar chord with me. The joke about the two Irish guys, some of you have heard it before maybe. The two Irish guys who live in Boston and love baseball. And they make a pact, Pat and Mike. They make a pact that whoever dies first will come back and tell the other one about baseball in heaven. So a couple of weeks later, sure enough, Pat gets hit by a bus and dies, and Mike is grieving. But one night, about 3 weeks later, he feels somebody waking him up in the middle of the night. And he says, "Oh my God, it's you, Pat. What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I told you I'd be back to tell you about baseball in heaven." And he said, "How is it?" He said, "You wouldn't believe it. It's wonderful." He says, "There's a new stadium." He says, "Our uniforms are gorgeous. They're green and gold." He says, it's really something. He says, "Last week, I was in the dugout, and who was there but Babe Ruth and Mickey Mantle?" He said, I just can't even tell you what it's like. So Mike says, "Holy smokes, that's really something." Pat says, "Now I've got some good news and some bad news." He says, "What's that?" He says, "The good news is that there's a big game on Saturday. The bad news is you're pitching." So I often think to myself, you never know when you're getting the call up from the bench, so you ought to enjoy today and be prepared. Thank you very much for your attention.
You mentioned Chiavo and Quinlan. Now, these were younger women, and I was in the trauma ward, and I saw a lot of people with motorcycle accidents. They were 30, 40, some with brain damage, and they could be there for 30 years. Now, the question I have is, people who are making living wills and advance directives usually are, say, 50, 60, 70. A younger person wouldn't think of it. Now, would you then maybe think of someone 35 or 40 doing this, because it's not only older people, and they would, but what would you say if you had a kid who was 35 and said, "Well, you got plenty of time"?
Nope. What I say is once you turn 18, fill it out.
Oh.
And incorporate it into part of your routine. I mean, why don't people want to deal with it? Because it's scary, it's uncomfortable, it's yucky, I don't want to think about that. I do this on a regular...
18?
Yeah, that's when you're legal. I mean, the bottom line is,
Okay.
all you do when you're 18 is say, you start the conversation. To me, a living will is not the end all and is all, but it's the start of a lifelong conversation so that your values become evolved. I mean, you see a story on television. Take the opportunity. You mean to tell me that all that time that Shava was on TV, all your families didn't have some discussion about, well, that's terrible what they're doing to her, or that's a great thing that they're trying to preserve her life, something along those lines, so that your values are able to come out and people know what you're talking about. Your family knows your values. I'm astounded how many people say, "Well, we never talked about that kind of thing. I have no idea." And then it puts you in a real bind in terms of what to do. So yeah, I recommend, when I do it with students, when I do it with nurses, when I do it with residents, I say, "You want to fill it out?" And they're all like, "I'm too young." Hey, listen, Karen Ann Quinlan was 19 years old. Cruzanne, 24 years old. Terry Schiavo was 23 when she had this event. So yeah, I say, as soon as you're of legal age, go ahead.
I'm very lucky in my family. We started those conversations about our parents and grandparents very young. And it's a whole lot easier to talk about whether they want to be cremated at 45 than at 85. And, you know, it evolved, and we could joke about it, and I always clinged to my dad. I was going to sprinkle his ashes on the floor so Mom could vacuum him up. And then as he got older, then that joke went away and things like that. So I would like to see it move all the way down into the elementary and secondary schools.
I think, as Mr. Kiernan says, there has to be an attitudinal change. We have to be open to having these discussions. It's a natural part of the life cycle.
Thank you for your very compassionate and candid comments about the book. I do, however, have 2 questions. The first involves palliative care. Is there a database of local doctors and hospitals, programs, other than hospice, that deals with palliative care, somewhere where we could go to find those people?
I think there are probably many websites that will give you educational information kinds of things. St. Peter's houses the community hospice, but typically hospice is not so much a place. Hospice is a service. Hospice is a concept, a philosophy. And so I would argue that most people who are on hospice care
are living at home with some supportive services. There are doctors that provide that care and oversight, presumably through the local hospice. I know there's one in Albany, there's one in Saratoga, there's one in Rensselaer, there's a multitude of hospices around. I would argue that a place like Albany Med, which is a tertiary care center, also needs palliative care specialists on board, but we have not been there yet, no.
No. And speaking of dying at home, what are the legal ramifications for family members for allowing the individual who has chosen to die peacefully at home? Hospice is not involved. Maybe you don't have this answer because it is legal. The person is dying, obviously, and says, please do not call the ambulance. What legal ramifications does that have?
None. I think that the main thing is to have a plan. If you're going to Dr. Jones, or you say it's your mother goes to Dr. Jones, and Dr. Jones says, she's got congestive heart failure, it's been getting worse and worse and worse. Maybe you'd like to have hospice, and I say, no, not really. I'd rather just do it on my own, or if my sister and I can do it, or whatever. I think the idea is that you're going to have a plan. You're going to keep in touch with the doctor or his nurse or somebody so that you're going to anticipate what's going to happen. And at some point, mom's congestive heart failure is going to cause her to have such breathing difficulties that she can't maintain life. There should be a plan in place where, I like the idea of having hospice or some kind of palliative involvement for support for the family, let alone the patient. But at some point, you'll have a plan. You won't call 911 and jump all over her and run her into the emergency room, that she'll be able to die very peacefully at home. The other piece I would say is that how many high-profile people are you reading about in the paper these days that do that at home? Jacqueline Kennedy, Cardinal, whatever, Reardon or something like that in Chicago, Bernardini, I guess, was in Chicago. Lots of them, Ronald Reagan. These people are not rushed to the emergency, and I don't think they're getting secondary care. I think they're getting the best care available, which is to die very comfortably at home the way that they wanted to. So again, it has to do with attitudes, but I don't think there are any legal ramifications if you have a plan. And then what you would do is that the doctor would come out or somebody would come out and pronounce the person dead, and then you would call the undertaker. And then I think every death in the state has to be sent to the coroner or reviewed by a coroner, and the coroner could make a decision at that point to review the case more carefully or not. But if it's an expected, anticipated death, that shouldn't be any issue
What
at all.
if it's not?
I think that the coroner has the ability then to review that case and even do an autopsy if needed.
And a patient or an individual doesn't have the legal right to have papers in process where no autopsy?
Oh, yeah. Oh, except that if it's an unanticipated death, I believe that the coroner has a right to come in and make a decision.
No, I'm not talking about gunshot.
Right.
I think actually any death that happens at home has to be reviewed by the coroner. I think
that may be, but I do think that if you have a plan and somebody is actively dying, that he could review that, but he's certainly not going to go much further. We're going to say that.
Or what the restrictions are, not death, but burial, that New York has, you can't generally be buried on your own property.
So
How about dogs? My dog's in the
my
backyard.
question is, how does the layperson learn more about all the different choices that the hospital may say to the person, oh, you should have a feeding tube or this? I mean, because sometimes if you start it, can you stop it?
Oh, it's overwhelming, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is Stephen Kiernan makes this point about having an advocate, and I think that's true. You can stop it once you've started it. I mean, withdrawal of something is the same morally and legally as withholding. In other words, if I go into the emergency room and I'm really having a hard time breathing, I can say to the doctor, I do not want a tube down my throat. And he will not put it in because you have to consent to be able to have that done. On the other hand, if I go on a breathing tube and then finally say, this is not going anywhere, I don't want to continue this, you have the right to stop it. Now, if you didn't have the right to stop it, how many people would really start it? I mean, a lot of people want to give it a trial, but they don't want to be stuck on it for life. I mean, in my experience, most people say, I don't want to be dependent on machines. And I say, well, that's fine, but maybe you just have a pneumonia, and if you're on it for 3 days, you get off. That's very different than being stuck on it. So yes, you can stop everything you start.
Right, so is there some pamphlet or some place, is it in this book? talks about all the things that the hospital could say, oh, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this?
Not really. I would say that each hospital is going to have their own information, their own personnel, resources, etc. I work at Albany Medical Center. I can only tell you that there is a patient information booklet that's given out when you come in and has a lot of this information there. And we have a very active ethics consultation service where our role is to try to support families making decisions.
So families can request input from
Absolutely.
someone that's not,
How did they do
not their
that?
actual physician.
It's in the booklet. You can either call directly through the operator or you can speak to your nurse who would be very happy to call for you.
There's a new program that hospice has instituted called the end-of-life team that, and this is volunteers, and they give special training as to how you can help the family, usually taking place in the home, sometimes in the hospital. But it's been really wonderful for families that have been able to come together and have some sort of facilitator that knows how to do this.
Yeah, as we said, there's a lot of unfinished business in families, and people don't turn into the Beaver Cleaver family at the 11th hour. Whatever sibling rivalry was in the background is now going to boil over. But I think when you have hospice involvement, there's a big focus on the family, not just on the patient, and on the grieving process, and they do follow up and all that.
Does that mean after death or prior to death that the hospice would come in?
Well, I belong to a team that when a person is actively dying, hospice calls me and says, look, we're putting a 24-hour group team on this person. Will you come and take the 2 to 4 shift or the 2 to 5 shift?
Prior to death.
This is prior, when they're actively dying.
That's good.
And we keep a little diary and we write down what the person says. Because sometimes they're mumbling even though they're semi-conscious.
So that would kind of tie in what you said about hospice not being a place, but being a service. It could be in the home or it could be...
Right, ideally in the
That
home.
makes a lot of sense, what you said. May I ask you a couple
Certainly.
of questions?
Go ahead.
You mentioned Terry Schiavo. I just wanted to ask, what do you think that the author's idea about that situation would be? What would he be in favor of in treating that situation?
No, I got it, and I can't speak for him, but my read is that he feels that that is futile care.
That's what I thought. I didn't know about it.
That's my read
It
on
should
it.
not have been kept for 10 or 20 years.
Well, I was thinking there have been two incidents recently where people who had been comatose or whatever for long periods of time kind of, came out.
Oh, the bane of my existence.
And but both of them slipped back in very shortly after.
There's a lot in the press when you have these outlier stories. It makes great press. There's no news about, so-and-so has been sick for 27 years and they finally died. And big deal, right? But somebody's been in a coma for 17 years and suddenly wakes up. Wow, that's news. And, when you read it, it sounds like quite the miracle story. And you almost expect it, you visited them, they'd be playing chess and eating hamburgers. Usually there's, a very brief period of awakeness and most of them fall back into it. And I don't think there's a good explanation for what happens to those patients. When we talk about persistent vegetative state, there are very strict criteria that you have to meet in order to get that kind of a diagnosis. And that has to be typically done by a neurologist. So if you don't have a good assessor, you may have a wrong diagnosis. That's really kind of frightening. But I take issue with a lot of these big media stories that set up a very false standard. I mean, you may have read about this baby recently who was born at 21 weeks and went home in Georgia or South Carolina. Did you see that? 21 weeks is unheard of. We had a discussion about this at the hospital with the neonatologists and the obstetricians. And this baby that went home, allegedly being born at 21 weeks, there are a lot of very great questions here. For one thing, this baby was the product of in vitro fertilization. So then I say, well, doesn't that make it real clear when the time frame was? And they say no. Did the fertilization take place on day 1 and it wasn't implanted until day 14 because the uterus wasn't ready to accept it? I mean, there are a lot of complexities that maybe don't meet the eye, but you read the story and all of a sudden every mom who's going to deliver a 21-week fetus thinks that this kid's going to be just fine if only you work a little harder, when in fact, that's a pre-viable state. I can't speak to this case of this baby at home. I never saw her. I'm not a doctor. But the bottom line is those outlier stories are outliers for a reason. Any other questions? Oh, my goodness. Two quickies.
Okay, is there a difference between long-term coma and persistent vegetative
Yes,
state?
there absolutely is. And I'm not a neurologist, but there are very specific criteria that would discriminate between those two diagnoses.
You used the example of a ruptured artery, and there was a time frame that exceeded, well, it was quite a long time before he died.
28 days.
And during that time period of 28 days, is it not possible for a medical person to locate that ruptured artery and repair it or replace it?
Oh, yeah. The problem is the horse is already out of the barn.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I said the horse was already out of the barn. His kidneys shut down. He died as a result of the ruptured aneurysm. And so, yeah, they brought him into the hospital and tried to deliver acute care to him, but he probably didn't get enough blood flow to his brain that he wasn't going to wake up. He clearly lost his kidney function. It just started a whole cascade of events. So bottom line is too late. No, I mean, a ruptured aneurysm is a life-ending event. It really is. They go in and try to repair some of them. And, you know, occasionally they're able to have someone survive, but for many people, that's it.
Probably too weak to survive after all that blood loss.
What's that?
A day, I mean hours.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for coming again.
You're very welcome.